There are two characters through which you can study the whole play. One is the inspector, and the other is Eva Smith. Eva is a fascinating character because we never meet her. We only hear of her through the perceptions of other characters. In this video, I'm going to try to clarify whether she is in fact one woman, or as Gerald supposes, several different women. And I'm also going to look at the symbolic role she plays in Priestley's message in the play. So the first thing I'm going to look at is this idea that she represents every woman. As the inspector says, there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths. And so she represents the working woman in 1912. Well, interestingly, there is a census registering every living person in the country every 10 years. So here we have the census for 1911, and I've put in Eva Smith, and we find that there are only 3,800 Eva Smiths in the whole country at that time. So the first question I've got to ask myself is, why has he chosen that name if it's actually very uncommon? The surname Smith's very common. Why has Priestley chosen such an unusual name to represent all working women? Well, I think there's an obvious reason. Eva is very like Eve, so the mother of all of humanity, if you take Genesis, and of course Priestley does, because his message in the play is also a Christian one, as well as a socialist one. And part of the way of achieving that is by having this main character reminiscent of Eve. He's deliberately chosen that as a name to suggest that actually we are all like her, or at least we are if we're working class. This point can be seen even more clearly if I restrict my search to just London, which is where the play would be performed and where the audience would mostly come from. And here there are only 504 results. In other words, nobody in the audience would know anyone called Eva Smith. That's the likelihood. And the fact that they didn't would get them to think about the symbolism behind the name Eva. It's not a coincidence, I think, that it sounds like Eve. Another aspect of history that the census will give you is an impression of what cities did to working women. So all these ticks here are women who've had to move into London in order to get work. And that's 10 out of 19. A huge number in the population who are transient, who've moved away from their families and are therefore vulnerable like Eva is. And as you'll find out, Eva's parents have died. She's got no brothers and sisters. She's got nowhere else to turn to. And that's not just a theatrical conceit, something that Priestley's just doing for the play. We can see here, historically, that's actually a very accurate view of what life might have been like. Another thing you might notice is the life expectancy. So I've underlined from one page here, I think this is the second page of the census, everyone who's over 40. And you can see that there are only two who work. So they're both dressmakers. So they're working maybe at home, but in better conditions. It might be a factory, but it won't be full of smoke or dangerous machinery. Completely different to the sort of factory that the Burlings operate. So we can see how vulnerable young women at that stage must have been. People didn't seem to live that long. And if they did, they had private means. They were independent. In other words, they were much like the Burlings, although maybe not quite as rich. Eva appears to commit suicide aged 24, which we think of as terrifically young, but in 1911 may not have been considered quite so young. So the next thing I'm curious about is the choice of the name Daisy. We might think that somebody named after a flower would be quite common. It feels right for the period. But when I look at the whole country, there are only 1,600 people called Daisy Smith. Daisy doesn't appear to be that common a name. And so again, it's being chosen for its symbolic value. A daisy is, I suppose, like a flower, innocent, but also vulnerable, can easily be picked. And look at how she is literally picked up, if you like, by Gerald and Eric, just picked out of the palace bar, like a flower. But of course, once a flower is picked, it has no roots and easily dies. It only blooms, keeps its bloom for a little while. And if we look a little deeper into this symbolism, that's what capitalism is doing. It's taking people out of the villages and off the land into cities where they have no roots, they've got no family, they've got very little to sustain them when things go wrong. Now, if we look a little deeper, for Daisy Renton, we can see that there are only 5 people on this list in the whole country, and we can look at the whole list, and then you can see actually there are only 3 whose first names are actually Daisy. The others all presumably have middle names of Daisy. So again, an incredibly rare name. So once again we ask ourselves, what is the symbolic reason? Well, once Eva changes her name to Daisy, we've seen how that indicates her vulnerability as well as her innocence, but this is contrasted by the word rent in Renton. One interpretation is that she becomes a woman for rent. Gerald literally rents her for a few months and then gets rid of her, and Eric appears to do the same. And what is ambiguous here is how consciously Eva decides to rent herself out. In both Eric and Gerald's accounts of their relationships, they always mention that they offer money, not for sexual services and not because Daisy has asked for money. But we must remember that she has chosen this name. In other words, she knows what she's entering into is a financial arrangement. She's never going to ask for money, but she's going to expect them, as partially decent men, to offer her money. And another reason for choosing the name Daisy Renton is that it is incredibly rare, and the inspector makes that very point. One, that she represents everyone, there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths, but also that she is very special and quite unique. And both these ideas need to be kept at the forefront of your thinking about this character, which is great because when you have 2 contrasting interpretations, as you'll know if you've been following my videos, that gets you into the A and A star territory. Now, I did ask myself if I'd just got lucky with these name choices, so I chucked in a few other names that I thought might be quite common. Here we have Mary Smith. There are 27,000, nearly 28,000 hits there. And the same with Elizabeth. There are 21,500 hits there. So we can clearly see that Priestley has deliberately chosen rare names for his character. And the points that I've made earlier I think are very valid and will certainly stand up to scrutiny in your essays. And a final point to reinforce that is this. Of the 5 daisies, absolutely none of them live in London. And so the chances are that no one in the audience watching this play had ever met somebody called Daisy Renton. And the only other working class character we meet in the play is Edna. And it's interesting to me that Edna and Eva are both incredibly short names, sharing so many letters. And perhaps Priestley is deliberately trying to suggest that all the working class are connected in this way, and they're connected in their suffering and treatment by the ruling class, here represented by the Burlings. So in this reading of the play, it's Edna who announces the inspector. So the working classes are bringing inspection against the upper classes. And this imagery is alluded to here when Priestley gives Burling these words, "Give us some more light." In other words, he's going to expose through lighting, through this metaphor, the truth about the Burlings. So the inspector uses Eva's death in order to shock these characters and perhaps get them to confess to their part. But look at the method of death. She swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Now, this is very revealing symbolically. She's obviously trying to disinfect herself. In other words, she's looking back at the choices she's made, even if she was forced into those choices, and the things that she's done, and she sees herself as infected or dirty, and she's got to disinfect or clean herself. Very interesting when you consider the relationship that we'll find she's had with Eric and Gerald, and also her own view of it, the self-disgust that this has brought about. Right from the beginning, we can see that Priestley is trying to give working class people a voice through Eva. So she, in fact, had left a letter and a sort of diary. In other words, she wants to be heard, she wants her story to be told, and Priestley, if you like, has set this up in order to tell that story. She appears to have no friends and family. It's very curious who this letter is to, and Priestley leaves this dangling, as though it might be a letter to posterity, for history to remember her, which Priestley is trying to do through the play. Priestley is also keen to point out that these young women, the type who work in factories and can't necessarily hold down jobs because they're vulnerable, inevitably get into various kinds of trouble. And so this isn't their fault, according to the inspector here. It's the lives that they are forced to lead because richer people are making decisions for them. Priestley also has Burling point this out. Well, we've several hundred young women there at the factory, and they keep changing. In other words, the job isn't enough to keep them in sufficient funds, and therefore they have to keep looking for work, or they get sacked, or they get ill. They are intensely vulnerable. And Eva is like Eve. She represents every woman who works in these kinds of factories. There is always a view in any society that those who are not paid well and are poor remain treated this way because they're not well educated enough, they do not work hard enough, they do not deserve more. And Priestley wants to get rid of this idea quickly. In the capitalist system, he's saying, you can be a good worker, you can be ready for promotion as Eva was, and you can still get sacked, you can still lose your job because everything is arranged against you. You have no power, but your employer has all the power. He makes this point even more forcefully by getting Burling to describe Eva this way. So even in his own opinion, she is an excellent asset to his business, yet he's still going to fire her. On stage, we're invited to contrast the opulence of the dining room table and what all the guests are wearing to this idea that Eva and her colleagues would get a 12% rise in wages. Although this sounds like a massive rise in wages, another way of looking at this is the difference between what they're paid and what a living wage would be. We see on several occasions during the play that those on strike have no savings. In other words, they only get enough money to spend each week and each month, and they are 12% short. In other words, they are always struggling for money. And this is the Burling's fault. It's not the workers' fault. It's not Eva's fault. Eric points out that women like Eva can't better themselves because they can't get work somewhere else, because all the other capitalists, all the other rich people, are offering the same sorts of wages. In other words, once you're poor, you're really trapped. Even if you keep your job, it's not enough, and you can't find a way to get more. Priestley also uses Eva to expose the values of capitalism and the hypocrisy of capitalism. As Eric points out, why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices. In other words, if the capitalist system was fair, employers could try and make as much money as possible out of customers, but workers would also be able to try to make a decent wage from their employers. But workers have less power, and therefore they don't. There are, of course, no unions that Eva and her fellow workers can go to, and Priestley is indirectly here using Eva to justify the need for unions. Together, employees have far more bargaining power than individually. The next point I'd like to make about Eva is that Priestley is very keen to showcase her femininity, the fact that she is a young woman. He's examining what it means to be female at this time, and he's also trying to point out that women are far more vulnerable than men. They've got it even worse. And he does this perhaps to get even more sympathy for his dead working class character, but also you might read his interest as a feminist one. Although this is written in 1945, this could be seen as a campaign for women's rights. So through Eva, he's keen to point out that women are often judged by their looks, not by how they perform at work. Interestingly, Sheila's jealousy means that Eva's looks have actually counted against her. If she hadn't been pretty, Sheila would not have been so jealous and would not have got her sacked. And this is the opposite of the pretty young women in a theatre audience. Those would be likely to be well off and well educated, and their good looks would have been a big asset to them, for example in finding a husband, or perhaps in employment. Next, Priestley wants to point out some of the historical data that I revealed earlier in the census information. So, both her parents are dead, which would have been possible for many women because of the mortality rate that we've seen. She hadn't been able to save much and therefore is always vulnerable. She can't cope with periods out of work because she'll have no money, and she's no one to turn back to. There are no relatives. This again gives us the idea of her being rootless when she becomes Daisy. She has few friends because obviously she's having to move to a city where she doesn't know anyone, and also work would have taken up most of the hours in the day, so there's less time to socialise. She's lonely and half-starved. Obviously, Priestley isn't just using Eva to represent all women. He also wants to create a character that we all feel sorry for because of what the family have done to her. He makes the idea that she would change her name seem quite natural, but after that she stopped being Eva Smith. But I don't know, actually, if this is historically an accurate idea. I think this is much more a dramatic device because it allows him to use the symbolism of Eva Smith and Daisy Renton. And of course a further dramatic device is that it allows Gerald to say that they all knew different girls. He, of course, knew a Daisy Renton, and Eric knew a girl who was neither called Eva or Daisy. This is essential for them to be able to deny that they have all contributed to the death of the same girl. This is interesting because if the characters all learn their lesson and accept that they've all been responsible, that implies there would be no second phone call. This is Priestley's way of saying that the second phone call is a result of a lesson not learned. However, a more cynical way of viewing this is to look at Priestley. If we're critical, we can say that he needs the second death to happen in order to educate his audience. So she becomes expendable. There was no way that Eva Smith was going to survive. This will also lead you to ask an interesting question about the mysterious inspector. Does the inspector leave because he needs the family not to learn the lesson, so that somehow, perhaps supernaturally, he can orchestrate the second death of Eva? In other words, in order for the family to learn the lesson, does he need Eva Smith to be expendable? Is he quite that ruthless? But Priestley certainly is. He's created the play, and he does not offer Eva the chance of survival. Perhaps he's saying that that's how it is in real life. Working class women are vulnerable, and many of them do die because of this, and it's because of the way the capitalist system exploits them. To reinforce this idea, he has the inspector say, there are lots of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in this country. In other words, Eva is a symbol of everybody. If there weren't, the factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour, and so now she is a symbol of the corruption of capitalism. The factories, the warehouse owners, they force people to work for little money. Sheila takes the opposite view. They aren't cheap labour, they're people. But of course, Gerald and Burling don't share that view. The inspector does, and what he wants is for us to put ourselves in the place of these young women counting their pennies in their dingy little back rooms. And perhaps this is why we don't meet Eva at any time. If you've watched the Alistair Sim black and white film, you will see all these flashbacks done in the cinema. The same could easily have been done on stage. The set would rotate, and we'd quite easily see the characters in flashback with Eva Smith. Perhaps Priestley deliberately does not do this because he wants to make clear to the audience that Eva is not a real person, or rather, she is a symbol of millions of people, and it's her symbolic value that is much more important. Of course, an audience that had just lived through the Second World War would have no difficulty in realising that life is very vulnerable, and in fact chance plays a huge part in whether you survive or not. But Priestley has to give this view for women pre-1914, before the First World War, and he points out here that a bout of influenza could easily lead to your losing your job. And why? Well, because influenza, the flu, was very frequently fatal. People didn't recover from it very frequently. So although Eva's death seems extraordinary in the play, actually Priestley is making the point that death is very common, as you would have seen from the average age on the census that I showed you. I said earlier that we should consider Priestley's role as a feminist. So let's look at this incident here. Sheila has got Eva sacked from her work, and she asked, did it make much difference? Yes, I'm afraid it did. It was the last real steady job she had. When she lost it, for no reason that she could discover, she decided she might as well try another kind of life. If you play a kind of what-if game, she could easily have survived having been sacked from the Burlings. As we see here, she gets a job. But she never gets another job in this play. This is her last chance of security. So one way of reading this is that Sheila is the worst of the characters, until we consider her mother. So Burling, all right, has sacked her, but has given her several months, perhaps a couple of years, of employment. Gerald has had an affair with her, but has given her financial security for a time. Similarly, Eric has done the same, but it's the women, Sheila and Mrs. Burling, who act so cruelly without giving anything in return. Sheila has given Eva nothing, Mrs. Burling has given Eva nothing. So perhaps Priestley is making a point about the powerlessness of women in this society. Sheila has no power to do any good to Eva. She can't really make her life any better because she herself has no power. The only way she can attain power in this play is by having good looks, being pretty, which she is, or by having wealth, being in a wealthy family, or by marrying well with Gerald. And we can see that she's willing to marry Gerald, even though she suspects very strongly that he's been having an affair even before he confesses it. In other words, Priestley's pointing out that the role of women in this society is very, very constricted and exploited by men. If we look a bit deeper, we might argue that women in this play are much worse to each other, because this seems to be the only way they can gain any kind of control in their lives. Priestley now uses Eva to contrast the role of looks in a working class life and an upper class life or an upper middle class life. So Sheila says, if she'd been some miserable plain little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it, meaning got her sacked. But she was very pretty and looked as if she could take care of herself. So in Sheila's world, you will be able to take care of yourself if you're pretty, because you will be able to find attention and ultimately marriage from men. In Eva's world, of course, and that's a much larger world because there are many more women in it, that's not true. Being very pretty gets you all kinds of attention from men, but you're just as likely to be exploited as married. And so, as I've discussed in the census part of the video, the name Daisy Renton is chosen symbolically. Daisy to suggest freshness and vulnerability, this idea of being uprooted and destined to fade and wilt and die, and Renton, this idea that she is for rent, even though she doesn't actually publicly ask for money from the men she meets. That can be the only possible end to the relationships. She's not a prostitute here in that she isn't for hire. You can't just buy her services for an hour or half an hour, but she is rented out by Gerald and rented out by Eric for long periods of time. Because she has chosen this name for herself, we might also suppose that partly this is her intention. She knows that is the only way for her to survive, and in her own mind is perhaps 2 or 3 rungs up the ladder from prostitution. For her it must be a terrible compromise, which in the end she feels disgusted at and kills herself with disinfectant. It's worth considering why Priestley is so particular about the months and dates in which people met this girl. And one reason is that it means it could all be the same girl. The chronology always matches up. And again, we find that there's possibly 6 weeks between being sacked from Millwards and her going to the Palace Bar, and that would be just the kind of time that she might survive on any kind of wages that she'd saved at Millwards. Priestley is also making a wider point here. He's saying that that's how vulnerable working women are. It only takes 6 weeks to take them from being morally respectable people to people who have to do something they don't agree with in order to survive. This is an incredibly unfair society, and it's a society that desperately needs the welfare state, which the Labour government is going to strengthen just after the production of this play. And it's the Labour government that Priestley wants to bring to power and get support for in his message in this play. Priestley also uses Eva to point out the corruption of the rich and the corruption in men. So Gerald goes to the Palace Bar knowing it's a favourite haunt of women of the town, and this is a euphemism for prostitution. And the very act of having a euphemism means that it's easier to hide. Burling's reaction is to show just how necessary he thinks it is to hide it. He doesn't even want to mention this subject in front of Sheila, which is deeply ironic because he's really saying, I don't want my daughter to know what you, Gerald, my future son-in-law, have been doing, having sex with prostitutes, and will probably keep on doing once you're married. So he's using Eva to show how working class women are exploited, but also to show how even wives of the rich are exploited by the behaviour of their husbands, and here their fathers. It's very common for students to see Eva as a way of Priestley attacking the class system. It's much less common for students to comment on her role in attacking the patriarchy. A patriarchy is any society run by men, excluding women from power. And so Priestley here is attacking men quite directly through Eva. Gerald gives us a physical description of Eva. She looked quite different to the other women in the bar who are offering themselves presumably for sex. She was very pretty, with soft brown hair and big dark eyes. The dark eyes were mentioned earlier, although I didn't mention it in this video, by Sheila when describing the girl she had sacked from Millwards. And Priestley is very clearly hinting that this is probably the same girl. Remember that Eric isn't here, but Burling is. So Burling would also recognise this as a description of Eva Smith. Priestley gives this description to Gerald because it's going to be Gerald who denies that it's all one girl. So he does this to point out Gerald's hypocrisy. He will cling on to any belief so long as he can believe he is less guilty. The hypocrisy of men is also revealed in Gerald's line here. I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. These are women he must have seen often. In other words, he must frequently visit the palace bar. Meeting Eva does not seem to be a one-off, chance, random event. It seems to be a pattern of behaviour. And what attracts Gerald to Eva is how she's young and fresh. In other words, she's vulnerable and corruptible. She's charming, so he can feel better about himself for exploiting her, and altogether out of place there. So she is worth saving, if you like, because she is someone that hasn't been ruined by sex with lots of other men. Gerald is going to claim that he was only thinking of Eva's welfare, but let's look at how he describes her twice here, the girl and the girl. To him, that is much more important than her name, Daisy Renton. It's the fact that she's young and feminine and someone that he can exploit that is important to him, not the real person, Daisy Renton, who he eventually abandons. This seems all the more cruel when he says she gave me a glance that was nothing less than a cry for help, but his help has come with conditions. He's going to put her up in lodgings, but the unspoken condition is, have sex with me or you lose the lodging. The inspector is going to say that Gerald has treated Eva quite well, but let's examine what he actually does. First, he takes her for a drink or two. In other words, he's getting her drunk because he wants to have sex with her. The inspector points out here, very carefully, that in later times she's obviously become much more like an alcoholic. Did she drink much at the time? So by the time she meets Eric, she's obviously become much more dependent on drink, and Gerald has partly led her there. He points out that all she wanted was to talk. She wanted a little friendliness. Not a friend, but a little friendliness. In other words, he's only offering her a very little in return for sex. Then Priestley has Gerald reveal many of the facts that we've already found out about Eva. She'd lost both parents, she'd had a job and had to leave after a strike, exactly like Eva, and something about the shop too. These can't be coincidences. It's very clear that Gerald has been involved with Eva Smith, and this is the same girl that Burling and Sheila Burling have exploited. So Priestley is using Eva to point out Gerald's hypocrisy. All the more so because these are Gerald's own words, which he's later going to deny. And then finally we've got this delightful moment of timing. He notices that at the moment she was actually hungry, and that's why she's getting drunk with this drink. And the inspector says, and then you decided to keep her as your mistress. In other words, finding out how vulnerable she was and how close to starvation, if you like, is what makes Gerald then offer her his help, because she can't refuse it, and he decides to make her his mistress. 2 nights later, his suspicions or hopes are confirmed. She hadn't a penny and was going to get turned out of the miserable back room she had, so she has literally nowhere to turn other than to him. This gives him all the bargaining power to do with her as he wants, because she is not in a position to refuse. The only thing she can do, instead of becoming his mistress, appears to turn to prostitution. Gerald is the lesser of 2 evils. And now we can see how Daisy is for rent. So I insisted on Daisy moving into these rooms, and I made her take some money to keep her going there. So although Daisy is desperate for money, she cannot ask for it. She wants to preserve the illusion that this is not a financial arrangement and that it's based on feeling. Gerald completely exploits her feelings. In its return for her being young and pretty, he exploits the fact that she is warm-hearted and generous towards him and intensely grateful. In other words, all the advantages are ones that he holds. I became at once the most important person in her life, and he exploits her that way. And Priestley is pointing out that for a vulnerable young woman, there is no equality in life. She's always in an unequal relationship with men, because they hold all the power. Again, Gerald is very precise about the chronology. So they split up in the first week of September. This is going to be important because it makes it very, very plausible that the woman that has a relationship with Eric is in fact the same woman. He lies to himself here, or at least tells a partial truth. Daisy knew it was coming to an end. This kind of suggests that she's accepting of it because the relationship was ending. But that's not exactly how it would have worked. Gerald is bringing it to an end. Why? Because his friend is coming back from Canada and will want his lodgings back. In other words, the feelings that Gerald has for Eva are so small that he would not even rent her an alternative place. She is worth no more money to him than he is already paying. They both maintain the illusion that this has not been a financial arrangement, and she, Eva, is very gallant about it. She is the one who most needs to maintain that illusion, because she does not want to see herself as selling herself for sex. But at this moment she must realise how cheaply Gerald has valued her. Once the property, which was free, is no longer available, she is simply discarded with. Priestley is quite subtle in blaming Gerald for this. He gets Gerald to point out that she didn't blame me at all. And Gerald takes comfort in the fact that she knew it couldn't last. In other words, she knew that Gerald would exploit her. And in Gerald's mind, this makes it okay. Even though she told me she'd never been happier. She'd been happier than she'd ever been before. So Gerald has given her the best time of her life, and yet that was an illusion. It was just a financial arrangement on his part. Again, we can see just how much he has exploited her. She'd saved a little money during the summer. She'd lived very economically on what I'd allowed her. In other words, he was giving her very little money. She had to make savings within what she was spending in order to have savings for later. And why did she need to save for later? because she knew Gerald was exploiting her. The fact that she loved him would count for nothing. In the end, he's given her a parting gift of money to see her through to the end of the year. This is perhaps a way of saving his conscience. In the end, Sheila has only money enough for 2 months away from the city. There is a strong symbolism here in choosing to leave the city and move to a seaside place. We might associate this with holiday and lack of work, but we also might associate it with the sea and this idea of being cleansed, which Eva brings us back to by her choice of suicide method with the disinfectant. Priestley now points out that women's lives are so exploited that the very happiest memory could still be based on an exploitation. So she has gone to remember all that had happened between them, but to treasure that memory, even though he was simply entering into a financial arrangement to use her when it suited him. The diary then becomes deeply ironic. It's not a story that she wants posterity and Priestley to tell. It's just a way of reliving those happy times and making them last longer in her own mind. Priestley then uses this devastating contrast. There's never been anything as good, and probably never will be again, for Eva. And Gerald's reaction, well, I never saw her again. He cuts her off totally without any regret at the pain he must have caused her. Here, Eva is a symbol not just for how the ruling classes treat the working classes, but for how men exploit and abuse women. In her final appearance in the play, she presents herself as Mrs. Burling. Now, she obviously knows Eric's name is Burling, and this is an attempt for her to gain respectability. This happened only 2 weeks ago, and so it is her last attempt to make a new life for herself. She's going to forget the fact that she was for rent, that she was Daisy Renton, and she's going to try and make herself more respectable, at least in her own mind. And the other side to this is that when she most desperately needs help because she is an unmarried mother, she knows that the other women who are the charity that can alleviate her poverty won't help her if she presents herself as an unmarried mother. So she has to claim that she was married, and she has to claim that her husband had deserted her. If she had simply come to the charity committee and say that she'd had sex with someone who'd since abandoned her, they probably wouldn't have helped her anyway. Again, Priestley is pointing out the extreme vulnerability of the worst off. The very people who need the most help are the ones who are not going to get it in this society. The other thing we notice about Eva is that she is incredibly idealistic. So she realises that Eric is silly and wild and drinking too much. She could have stayed with him and kept taking the stolen money. Indeed, she could have saved a lot of it, but she chooses not to. She could have asked him to marry her, and he might well have gone along with it, but she dismisses that. It would be wrong for them both, because neither of them love the other. So another part of Eva's tragedy is that she remains such a good and moral person, even when she has to do immoral acts. Priestley is deeply ironic when he gets Mrs. Burling to reveal her class prejudice, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. But of course, we can look at the arrangement between Gerald and Sheila as a financial arrangement. It certainly is for Burling, bringing the Crofts and Burling and Company together. And we can also see that in the marriage of Mr. Burling to Mrs. Burling. Upper-class marriages often seem to be based very much on money as well as on love. In a capitalist society, perhaps everything is reduced to money, and for those who aren't persuaded of this, there is only death, as Eva chooses, because she does not take the path that would lead her to getting more money. Eva's moral stance is highlighted several times. He'd said something when he was drunk that gave her the idea that it wasn't his money. She didn't want to take stolen money. In other words, she has moral values, unlike the Burlings and Gerald. So Priestley is making a profound comment that he actually alluded to earlier in the play in response to Gerald, by saying that it wasn't very easy to tell the difference between respectable citizens and criminals. And he uses Eva now to drive that message home. Once again, Priestley brings us to the chronology. So Gerald has split with Daisy in September, and here we are, November, and suddenly she's back at the Palace Bar. The chronology fits exactly. The pattern of the relationship also works exactly the same as Daisy Renton. She'd been drinking, she didn't have much to eat, and therefore was vulnerable, exactly as Daisy had been when she met Gerald. He notices exactly the same things about her. She wasn't the usual sort. And just as Gerald had noticed that she looked out of place, Eric says, I suppose she didn't know what to do. Not only does this suggest that this is the same woman, but also that what attracts both men is her vulnerability, the ability they then have to exploit her. Eric has conveniently forgotten just how he exploited her, by claiming that he was too drunk to remember. Afterwards, she told me she didn't want me to go in, but he's forced himself into her lodgings, and there is a very strong hint that he's forced himself upon her sexually. He says, when a chap easily turns nasty, which is a euphemism for him actually using violence against her. And I threatened to make a row. Again, if you watch my video on Eric, I use this to suggest that actually he's probably raped her. And the fact that he speaks in euphemism, calls himself a chap rather than saying me, and calls it a row, does suggest that he's hiding from himself what actually took place. At this stage in her life, Priestley wants us to know that Eva is coping less well. After she has been abused by Eric, a fortnight transpires where she may have been involved with other men who perhaps have paid her for sex. The inspector alludes to this by referring to it as by appointment. But no, he meets her accidentally, and this time the inspector says more drinks. One way of looking at this is he's asking Eric if he was drunk again, but another way of looking at it is he's inquiring after how drunk Eva was. And again, Eric is attracted to the very things that Gerald was. She was pretty and a good sport, echoing Gerald's words, again suggesting this is the same woman. Very quickly it transpires, so next time or the time after that, she becomes pregnant. And here we meet Eva's morality again. She could have considered an abortion, which in those days would have been quite dangerous, but she doesn't. She worries about the child, but doesn't think about getting rid of it. There is the possibility of marrying. Eric must presumably have mentioned this to her, which is why he says she didn't want me to marry her. There's an implication that she's turned him down. And she'd told him that he didn't love her. In other words, she's still very idealistic, despite the choices that she's had to make in her life. It's really revealing that Eric adds this, and all that, as though to dismiss this idea of love. Again, Priestley could be saying that the upper classes lead a shallower life than the working classes. Working class people still have hope and still cling to this idea of a better future, through love, whereas the rich are so used to exploiting people that they're very happy to exploit each other as well. Love is not important to them. Although Eva has very little power, the fact that she's going to have Eric's child gives her some small bargaining power. She says to him that she didn't feel like trying again for work. This is an extraordinary thing to say if she believes that Eric will simply discard her. But Eric obviously has some decency and wants to provide for her. He gives her about £50. So there were 10 shillings in a pound, which means this money is about 25 weeks' work at the Burlings. The New Year's Honours list would be coming out in January, so at most 3 months can have passed between meeting Eric and her killing herself. And we have to ask ourselves the question, where's all this money gone? One possibility is that she has spent it all on drink, so she gets through much more money than she did when she was employed. Priestley could be using that as a way to show how her life has been degraded by the way she's been treated. Or another alternative is that she chooses to kill herself when she still has savings. In this view, we would imagine she hadn't gotten through all this £50. But if that's the case, why go to Mrs. Burling's charity and ask for help unless she was desperate? So on balance, it seems that Priestley is using this as a way to show how she has become increasingly dependent on alcohol and is actually wasting money. He's not explicit about this, presumably because he doesn't want us to blame her. He wants us to sympathise with her. Her final decision, before she kills herself, is used by Priestley to show that the working classes are better than the upper classes who rule them. So rather than accept more money because it is stolen, she decides to protect Eric so his thieving will not be discovered and ask for money from the charity. This is a contrast to how the rich might behave. We've already seen Gerald and Burling quite happy to keep down the wages of those who work for them. In other words, stealing from the workers in just the way that Eric has stolen from his father's work. So Eva, even at the hour of her greatest need, proves to be far more moral than her social superiors. The inspector's final words about Eva make it really clear that she serves a symbolic and political purpose. She is one of millions and millions of Eva Smiths, and she also represents male workers, the John Smiths, but as I've tried to show, Priestley is also really interested in how women are exploited far more than men, and so he centres his narrative around her. I've also alluded to the fact that Eva sounds very much like Eve, and that this is deliberate, as the section on the census will indicate, and this is because Priestley wants to use this religious Christian metaphor, this idea that we're all of one body, language which would be familiar from the Christian service, and which Priestley is using to promote socialism by saying that it is very similar to Christianity. Through naming Eva this way, he is reminding us that we are all descended from Eve, in other words, making much stronger the connection between us and the Eva Smiths. Priestley's final words about Eva remind us that her death is there as a lesson. As Sheila points out, we've nothing to learn. She says this sarcastically after the behaviour of her parents and Gerald. Sarcastically she says, we can all go on behaving just as we did. This reminds us that Eva had to die, and this will be brought home to us at the end of the play with the second death. The new girl has died in the same place or on the way to the infirmary after swallowing some disinfectant, again symbolically to try and cleanse herself because she feels dirty, having been exploited, having been forced to make decisions that she did not want to face. With this ending, Priestley is asking the question, how many more young women have to die before you, the ruling classes who are watching this play, learn your lesson and seek social justice instead of exploiting people's weaknesses? And that's what Eva represents.